the billionaire lived in a world that most people could only dream about. His house was not just big, it was like a palace. Tall glass windows, polished marble floors, and gold-framed paintings decorated every corner. Expensive cars rested in his garage, and his clothes were stitched by famous designers. To the outside world, he seemed like the luckiest man alive. People admired his success, his style, and the way he carried himself. But behind all the glitter and wealth, he carried something that no one could see, a heavy heart filled with doubts. He had earned his fortune through hard work and clever decisions, but along the way, he had lost something important: trust. People around him often wanted favors or money, and he had learned the hard way that not everyone had pure intentions. Over time, he became suspicious of almost everyone, even the ones closest to him. He believed that people only acted kind when they wanted something in return. Among the many workers in his mansion was a maid who had been serving him for years. She was a quiet, hard-working woman who came from a simple background. She never complained about her job, and she treated the billionaire's house as if it was her own. She polished the floors until they shined, cooked simple meals when asked, and always greeted him with respect. For her, the job was more than just a source of income, it was her lifeline. She had a young son who was her world, and everything she did was for his better future. The billionaire had seen the boy a few times. He was polite, well-mannered, and always carried a shy smile. Sometimes, when the maid worked long hours, the boy would come to the mansion after school to wait for his mother. He would sit quietly in a corner with his books, never disturbing anyone. At first, the billionaire paid little attention to him. But slowly, small thoughts began to enter his mind. Whispers from outside began feeding his doubts. Some visitors, jealous employees, and distant relatives made passing comments: "Are you sure it's safe to let that boy roam around the house? Children are curious. What if he touches something valuable?" Others would say, "You trust your maid too much. She has access to everything. What if her son learns bad habits from seeing all this wealth?" The billionaire tried to brush these remarks aside, but late at night when he sat alone, they returned to his mind. He started noticing little things, not because they were wrong, but because he was suspicious. He would see the boy's eyes looking at the shiny ornaments in the house, and he would wonder, what if one day temptation takes over him? He knew the maid was honest, but what about the boy? Children were innocent, yet also curious. What if curiosity led him to do something wrong? The billionaire hated that he was thinking this way. Deep down, he wanted to believe in goodness, but his past experiences with betrayal made him restless. Once, a close business partner had cheated him. Another time, a trusted friend had stolen money. Even a family member had tried to take advantage of him. These memories built walls around his heart. Now, even a small innocent child could not escape his doubt. The conflict grew inside him. He admired the boy's politeness but could not silence the voice in his head that asked, "Is it real? Or is it just an act?" One evening, as he sat by the grand fireplace with his thoughts swirling, he decided he could no longer live with this uncertainty. He needed to know the truth for himself. Not by listening to rumors, not by depending on others, but by seeing with his own eyes. So, he made a plan. It would be simple, quiet, and revealing. He would not confront the maid or her son directly. Instead, he would create a moment where the boy would be tested without knowing it. Only then could he see the boy's true nature. The plan formed in his mind like a puzzle fitting into place. The next day, when the maid brought her son to the mansion, the billionaire acted as though it was just another ordinary day. He greeted them briefly, pretending to be busy with phone calls and paperwork. But inside, his heart was restless. He had already decided that later, he would carry out his test. As the afternoon came, the house became quiet. Sunlight filtered through the tall curtains, and the ticking of the clock echoed softly in the background. The maid was in the kitchen preparing food, and the boy was sitting in the living room, reading a school book. The billionaire entered the room casually. In his hand was his expensive leather wallet, thick with cash, and on his wrist was a gleaming gold watch. He deliberately placed the wallet on the table near the sofa and adjusted his watch so that it caught the light. He wanted everything to look tempting and easy to reach. Then, he leaned back on the sofa, stretched a little, and slowly closed his eyes. To anyone watching, it would look like he had drifted off into a nap. But behind those closed eyelids, he was fully awake, his ears sharp, and his mind alert. He could hear the faint sound of the boy's pages turning. He could sense the stillness of the room. Every second felt like an hour as he waited to see what the boy would do. His heart beat faster with a mix of fear and curiosity. Would the boy be drawn to the wallet? Would he quietly slip it into his pocket, thinking no one would notice? Or would he leave it untouched? The billionaire's mind raced with possibilities, each one stronger than the last. In that quiet room, with the golden light of evening spilling across the floor, a silent test had begun. The billionaire, a man who had seen the world, who had trusted and been betrayed, who owned everything but peace of mind, lay pretending to sleep. And just a few steps away sat a young boy, innocent yet unknowingly under the sharpest gaze he would ever face. The billionaire's doubts, fears, and hope all blended into that single moment. His wealth, his mansion, and his past experiences no longer mattered. What mattered now was the choice a child would make in the presence of temptation. And as he lay still, pretending to rest, he could feel the weight of truth approaching him, whether it would bring relief or disappointment. He did not yet know. The billionaire had made up his mind. Once he decided on something, he never backed away. His entire empire had been built on bold decisions, careful risks, and clever strategies. But this plan was not about business. It was about trust. He wanted to see the truth with his own eyes, without asking anyone else, without letting gossip shape his beliefs. That evening, he sat alone in his study and thought carefully about every detail. If the boy knew he was being tested, the whole point would be ruined. The child had to believe the billionaire was asleep, unaware, and defenseless. Only then would his true character come forward. It was a strange plan, but the billionaire believed it was the only way to silence the doubts that had been bothering him for weeks. He thought about the wallet, the watch, the jewelry, and other items scattered around his house. There were many things that could tempt someone, especially a boy who came from a simple life. He imagined the situation through the boy's eyes, sitting in a giant house filled with wealth, seeing money and expensive items lying unguarded, and realizing no one was watching. What would a child do in such a moment? That was the question that kept him awake at night. The next morning, the mansion was filled with its usual rhythm. The gardener trimmed the hedges, the maid cleaned the living room, and the boy sat quietly in a corner doing his homework. The billionaire walked through the rooms as if everything was normal. He greeted the boy with a polite nod and asked the maid about her day. But inside, his mind was restless. His plan was ready, and he knew he would carry it out that very afternoon. When the clock struck 3, the house grew quieter. The sun was softer now, casting long golden lines across the marble floor. The maid went into the kitchen to prepare tea, leaving the boy in the living room. The billionaire entered the room casually, holding his wallet in one hand and wearing his shining gold watch. His footsteps echoed softly as he crossed the room. He acted as though he was tired from work, stretching his arms and yawning loudly. He placed the wallet carefully on the edge of the table, making sure it was clearly visible. Then he sat down on the sofa, leaned back, and adjusted the watch on his wrist so it caught the sunlight. He wanted everything to look natural, yet tempting enough for a curious child to notice. Slowly, he leaned to one side, rested his head on the cushion, and let his body go still. He closed his eyes and began to breathe slowly, pretending to fall into a deep nap. His breathing was steady, but his ears were wide open. Every sound in the room felt louder: the ticking of the clock, the faint rustling of the boy's notebook, even the distant sound of the maid's footsteps in the kitchen. The billionaire's heart beat faster than usual. He felt like a hunter waiting in silence, though he wasn't hunting for prey. He was waiting for the truth, whatever it might be. He thought to himself, if the boy is honest, I will know. If he is not, I will also know. The weight of the moment pressed on him heavily. The boy sat a few feet away, his schoolbook open on his lap. At first, he didn't notice anything unusual. But after a while, his eyes wandered toward the man sleeping on the sofa. He saw the wallet lying on the table, the gold watch shining faintly, and the powerful man who seemed to be fast asleep. The billionaire, though his eyes were closed, could sense the boy's movements. He imagined the boy's thoughts. Was he tempted? Was he nervous? The silence stretched, making every second feel like a long minute. The boy stood up quietly. His footsteps were soft against the carpet as he moved closer. The billionaire's heart raced. This is it, he thought. Now I will see. He fought the urge to open his eyes. His whole body remained still, but inside, he was restless. The boy bent slightly near the sofa. He looked at the billionaire, his small eyes filled not with greed but with something else: concern. The boy noticed that the man's shoes were still on, and his body looked stiff as he lay uncomfortably. Then he glanced at the wallet on the table. Instead of reaching for it, he carefully picked it up and placed it back properly in the center of the table, aligning it neatly as if to protect it. The billionaire felt a rush of surprise, but he stayed quiet. The boy then looked at the blanket folded neatly on the other sofa. He walked over, picked it up with both hands, and gently placed it over the billionaire's shoulders. He tucked it carefully so it wouldn't slip off. The billionaire, still pretending to sleep, felt the warmth of the blanket and something else: a warmth in his heart that he hadn't felt in a long time. The boy stood there for a moment, watching silently to make sure the man was comfortable. Then he whispered softly, almost to himself, he might catch a cold if he sleeps like this. After that, he quietly walked back to his corner, sat down with his book, and continued reading as though nothing had happened. The billionaire was frozen. His plan had been meant to expose dishonesty, but instead it had revealed kindness. He had expected temptation, but what he saw was pure innocence and respect. The boy had not only resisted touching the wallet or the watch, but had also gone out of his way to care for him. His chest tightened with emotion, but he forced himself to stay still. He wanted to hold on to that moment a little longer, to let the truth sink in. For years, he had doubted people's hearts. He had believed that honesty was rare, that trust was dangerous. But here, in his own living room, a child had just shown him something he had almost forgotten: the simple goodness that still existed in the world. Time passed slowly as he remained under the blanket, pretending to rest. He replayed every detail in his mind: the boy aligning the wallet, the gentle way he covered him, the whispered words of concern. It was not just honesty, it was kindness. And kindness was something even wealth could not buy. The billionaire realized he had been wrong to doubt the maid and her son. The boy's actions spoke louder than any promise or explanation could. In that quiet living room, the test he had created ended not with disappointment, but with a lesson he himself needed to learn. When the maid returned to the room carrying a tray of tea, she saw the billionaire under the blanket and smiled, thinking he had simply dozed off. She placed the tray on the table and called her son softly to help her. The boy stood up quickly, ready to assist, his face calm and innocent. The billionaire kept his eyes closed, but inside his mind, he was no longer the same man he had been an hour ago. His plan had worked, but not in the way he expected. Instead of confirming his doubts, it erased them. Instead of exposing dishonesty, it revealed purity. And as he lay there quietly, he knew that when he finally opened his eyes and spoke, life in his mansion would never be the same again. The billionaire stayed under the blanket, still pretending to be asleep, even though his heart was awake and racing. What he had just witnessed shook him in a way he never expected. He had planned to test the boy's honesty, but instead he had been tested himself. The boy had not touched the wallet or the shining watch. Instead, he had shown a kind heart by making sure the man was comfortable. For the first time in many years, the billionaire felt guilty for doubting someone so innocent. He could hear the soft sound of pages turning as the boy returned to his book. The billionaire listened to the maid's quiet movements in the kitchen as she hummed a simple tune. Everything seemed normal in the house, yet to him, nothing was the same anymore. His world, which had been covered with suspicion and fear of betrayal, had just cracked open, showing him a glimpse of something pure and genuine. He thought back to his own childhood. He remembered being young, curious, and playful, but his life had been different. He had grown up with struggles, and in those days, he had seen how temptation could easily lead children to mistakes. He himself had once been tempted, and though he never stole, he remembered the thoughts of wanting what he could not have. That memory was one of the reasons he doubted people now. But this boy was different. He had been placed right in front of temptation and had chosen to act with honesty and kindness. The billionaire finally decided to open his eyes, but he did it slowly, as though he was waking from a nap. The boy noticed and immediately looked up from his book. He smiled shyly, then lowered his eyes again, as if he didn't want to disturb the man. The billionaire stretched his arms and pretended to yawn, as though nothing unusual had happened. His wallet was still on the table, perfectly aligned, and the blanket was resting gently over his shoulders. He looked at the boy for a moment. "Were you studying?" he asked softly, his voice calm. "Yes, sir," the boy replied in a polite tone. "I was just finishing my schoolwork." The billionaire nodded. "Good. Education is important." His words carried more meaning now, because he was already thinking of how he could change this boy's life. The maid entered the room at that moment, carrying a tray with tea and some simple biscuits. She smiled warmly at her employer. "You fell asleep, sir. You must have been tired." She set the tray down carefully. The billionaire glanced at her, then at her son, and felt a heavy weight in his chest. He wanted to tell her what had happened, but he chose to remain silent for now. Instead, he sipped the tea slowly and watched the boy nibble quietly on a biscuit. Later that evening, after the maid and her son had gone home, the billionaire sat alone in his grand living room. The house was silent, but his thoughts were not. The image of the boy covering him with the blanket kept returning to his mind. It wasn't just an act of honesty, it was an act of love, a kind of care that money could never buy. For the first time in years, the billionaire felt tears forming in his eyes. He wiped them quickly, ashamed of his own weakness. He had spent so long building walls around himself, thinking that no one could be trusted. Yet a child had broken those walls with nothing more than a simple gesture. The next day, he watched carefully as the maid and her son arrived again. The boy carried his school bag, and the maid looked tired but determined as always. The billionaire noticed how she gently reminded her son to be polite and respectful, how she encouraged him to focus on his studies. He realized that the boy's honesty did not come from luck, it came from the way his mother had raised him. She had taught him values that were stronger than temptation. During the day, the billionaire tested the boy again, though not with money this time. He left a pen made of silver on the table, one of his favorites. When he returned later, the pen was still there, untouched, exactly where he had left it. Another time, he noticed the boy looking at a book on his shelf, a rare one bound in leather. The boy's eyes lingered on it, but instead of pulling it down without permission, he turned back to his schoolwork quietly. Every action the boy took reminded the billionaire that his doubts had been wrong. But it was not just honesty that surprised him. It was the small acts of kindness. One afternoon, When the maid was busy cleaning the kitchen, the boy quietly filled a glass of water and placed it near his mother, saying, "You should drink, Mama." Another time, he helped the gardener pick up fallen leaves, even though no one had asked him to. The billionaire noticed these things, each one like a seed planted in his heart, growing into something new. The billionaire found himself thinking more and more about the boy's future. He wondered what kind of man the child would become if he had the right education, the right opportunities, and the right guidance. He had seen many children of wealthy families waste their lives in laziness, while this boy, with so little, carried a spirit richer than gold. One evening, the billionaire finally decided it was time to reveal the truth. He called the maid and her son into the living room. They stood politely, unsure of why he looked so serious. The boy held his school bag tightly, and the maid folded her hands nervously. The billionaire took a deep breath and spoke. "There is something I must tell you," he began slowly. "Yesterday, I pretended to be asleep on this sofa. I left my wallet on the table and my watch in plain sight. I wanted to see what your son would do. I wanted to test him." The maid's face turned pale. She looked down in shame, hurt by his words. But before she could speak, the billionaire continued. "I was wrong to doubt. I thought perhaps he would take something, even out of curiosity. But instead, he placed the wallet neatly back, and he covered me with a blanket. He cared for me, even when I was unfairly testing him." The maid's eyes filled with tears. She looked at her son with pride and relief. The boy shifted uncomfortably, not sure how to respond. The billionaire's voice softened. "I apologize for doubting you and your son. What he did showed me something I had forgotten, that honesty and kindness still exist in this world. I will never forget it." The maid wiped her tears and whispered, "Thank you, sir. I have always taught him to respect others and to value honesty. I am grateful you saw his heart." The billionaire smiled faintly. "Yes, I did. And from now on, I want to make sure his future is secure. I will take responsibility for his education. He deserves every chance to succeed." The boy's eyes widened in surprise. He looked at his mother, then at the billionaire. His small voice finally spoke, "Thank you, sir. I will study hard. I promise." At that moment, the billionaire felt a peace he had not known in years. His test had given him an answer, but it had also given him something more valuable, a reason to trust again. The billionaire's words had left the maid speechless. She stood there with her hands trembling slightly, not because of fear but because of the emotions that rose in her heart. For years, she had worked in silence, cleaning, cooking, and managing the household without ever expecting special recognition. Her only dream was to provide for her son, to give him a life better than her own. And now, hearing her employer admit his doubts and then apologize felt like an unexpected miracle. Her son, standing beside her, looked confused at first. He was too young to understand why someone so rich and powerful would feel the need to test him. But he could sense the seriousness of the moment. His mother's teary eyes told him it was something important. The billionaire's calm but heavy tone told him it was something that could change their lives. The room was filled with silence for a while after the confession. The sound of the clock ticking on the wall was the only reminder that time was moving. The billionaire leaned back in his chair, his gaze soft but thoughtful. He had spent so many years doubting the people around him, building walls of suspicion so high that even the simplest gestures of kindness could not reach him. And now, because of a boy's honest action, those walls had started to crumble. The maid lowered her head. "Sir, I never knew you doubted us. If I had known, I would have tried harder to prove our honesty. But I am grateful you saw the truth yourself." The billionaire shook his head slowly. "No, it is I who should be grateful. Your son showed me something that I had almost forgotten. His actions reminded me that not everyone is driven by greed. He reminded me of the innocence and goodness that still exist. The boy looked up at the man, his small hands clutching his school bag. "I only did what my mother taught me," he said softly. "She always says we should take care of others and never touch what doesn't belong to us." The billionaire's heart softened even more. Those words echoed in his mind. They were simple, yet they carried wisdom that many adults failed to live by. He realized that honesty was not something that came naturally, it was something carefully planted by those who raised you. And this boy's mother had planted it well. That night, after they left, the billionaire sat in his study for hours, staring at the flickering light of the fireplace. He thought about his life, his wealth, his friends, and the betrayals he had suffered. He thought about the many people who had disappointed him. But his mind kept returning to that one moment when the boy had covered him with the blanket. It had been such a small act, but its meaning was enormous. It was as if the universe had chosen that moment to show him a lesson. Over the next few days, the billionaire's attitude began to change. He noticed the boy more, not just as the maid's son but as a young soul with potential. He asked him questions about school, about his favorite subjects, and about his dreams for the future. At first, the boy was shy, unsure of how much to say. But slowly, he began to open up. "I like math," the boy said one afternoon. "I want to become an engineer. I want to build things that can help people." The billionaire smiled at that answer. It reminded him of his own younger days when he had dreamed of building an empire, though his motivations back then had been very different. He realized that the boy's dream was pure, untouched by greed. He wanted to build not for wealth but for purpose. The maid noticed these changes too. She saw her employer taking more interest in her son's future. She watched as he encouraged the boy to study harder, sometimes even gifting him books or simple tools for learning. She felt a sense of relief, knowing that her years of sacrifice might finally bear fruit. But the billionaire was not done with his inner struggle. Although he admired the boy, part of him still fought with the habit of suspicion. One evening, when he was alone, he asked himself quietly, "Why did I need to test him? Why couldn't I just trust?" He realized that his fear of betrayal had made him harsh, even unfair. It had blinded him from seeing the truth without proof. And now, he felt a responsibility to make up for that mistake. So he made a decision. He would not only support the boy's education but also guide him personally. He wanted to become more than just a sponsor. He wanted to become a mentor, someone who could help shape the boy's future. The next day, he called the maid and her son to his study again. His tone was different this time, gentler, warmer. He looked at the boy and said, "You have taught me a lesson I will never forget. In return, I want to give you something that can change your life. From today onward, I will pay for your schooling. Not just now, but until you finish your education. Whatever you need to study, I will provide. You will not have to worry about money." The maid gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. Her son's eyes widened with disbelief. "Sir, we cannot accept so much," the maid whispered, tears already forming in her eyes. "You can," the billionaire replied firmly but kindly. "Because this is not charity. This is an investment in honesty. Your son has shown me that truth is still alive in this world. And I want to reward that truth." The boy lowered his eyes humbly. "Thank you, sir. I will not waste this chance. I will study hard and make you proud." The billionaire smiled, and for the first time in many years, the smile reached his eyes. He felt lighter, freer, as though a burden had been lifted from his shoulders. The test that had started as a way to confirm his doubts had ended with a gift not just for the boy, but for himself. It gave him peace, trust, and hope. In the following weeks, the atmosphere in the mansion changed. Where once there had been cold formality, there was now warmth. The boy grew more comfortable, sometimes sharing stories from school or showing the billionaire his notebooks. The billionaire found himself listening with genuine interest, often giving small pieces of advice. He was surprised at how much joy he felt in these simple interactions. At night, when he walked through the grand halls of his mansion, he no longer felt the same emptiness he once did. Wealth was still around him, but now it was no longer the only thing he saw. He had found something far more valuable: the ability to trust again. He thought often about the day when he pretended to sleep. He remembered the stillness of the room, the weight of the wallet on the table, the warmth of the blanket being placed over him. That single act of kindness had melted years of suspicion. It had turned a cold heart warm again. And as he stood by the tall windows, watching the night sky filled with stars, he whispered to himself, "Sometimes the smallest actions show us the biggest truths." The decision the billionaire made that day was not just a promise, it was a turning point in his life. For years, he had surrounded himself with walls, mistrusting even those who wished him well. His wealth had given him everything: cars, houses, fame, power, but it had not given him peace. Yet a boy's simple act of honesty and kindness had managed to break through the chains he had carried for so long. From the next morning onward, he began to see things differently. When the maid arrived with her son, the house did not feel like a place of labor and duty anymore, it felt alive. The boy's footsteps no longer blended with the sound of the ticking clock, they added warmth to the mansion's silence. The billionaire would sometimes watch him as he bent over his notebooks, concentrating hard on his sums, or when he sat reading a simple storybook with a quiet smile on his face. There was something about the boy's presence that reminded him of what life was truly about. The maid too noticed the change. Her employer, once so distant and cold, now greeted her with softer eyes and kinder words. He asked about her health, her work, and most importantly, her son. At first, she could hardly believe the change. She had always respected him, but she never expected him to open his heart in this way. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, the billionaire invited them both to sit in the living room with him. He rarely shared his personal life, but that day was different. He began to tell them about his past. He spoke about how he had worked his way up from nothing, how he had trusted people who later betrayed him, and how those betrayals had made him bitter. "I thought trust was a weakness," he admitted, his voice heavy. "I thought kindness was something people used to fool you. That's why I doubted everyone, even you. But your son has shown me I was wrong." His honesty was not weakness. It was strength. And his kindness was not a trick. It was real. The maid listened with tears in her eyes. She knew the weight of his words. She knew what it meant for a man like him, who had built his life on power and suspicion, to admit that he had been wrong. Her son, sitting quietly beside her, absorbed every word. Though he was still young, he understood the importance of truth and the value of trust. And now, he saw clearly how one simple action had changed not only his own life but also the life of the man sitting before him. As days turned into weeks, the billionaire kept his promise. He personally met with teachers, arranged for the boy's admission into one of the best schools in the city, and paid for everything the boy would need: uniforms, books, even transport. The boy, shy at first, slowly grew more confident. He studied hard, determined not to waste the opportunity he had been given. The maid, seeing her son walk into classrooms she had once only dreamed about, felt a gratitude so deep that words could not capture it. She often looked at her employer with silent prayers in her heart. She had scrubbed floors and cleaned dishes for years, never expecting life to offer her son such a gift. The billionaire, on the other hand, found himself changing more than he expected. He began looking forward to the boy's updates from school. Whenever the boy shared his marks or spoke excitedly about a new lesson, the billionaire felt proud, almost as if the boy were his own. He even found himself smiling more often, something his staff noticed but dared not mention. But the story did not stay hidden within the walls of the mansion. Word spread quietly through the community. People spoke of how a billionaire, once known for his coldness, had been moved by a maid's son. They spoke of how he had chosen to invest in the boy's future instead of ignoring him. Some were surprised, some admired it, and others were inspired. The boy's story became an example for other children. Teachers would tell their students, "Honesty will open doors for you, even ones you cannot see today." Parents told their children, "Do not take what is not yours." Look how honesty changed that boy's life. The billionaire himself also became an example. Other wealthy men and women in his circle began to notice the change in him. He spoke less about business and more about values. He encouraged others to support the children of their workers, not out of charity but out of belief in their potential. Some of them followed his lead. In this way, the small act of a boy covering a man with a blanket spread its light much farther than anyone had imagined. Yet for the billionaire, the most precious change was the peace he now carried in his heart. Before, his nights had been restless, filled with suspicion and worry. Now, he often found himself sitting by the fireplace, remembering the boy's words, "Mama says we should never touch what doesn't belong to us." Those words became like a guiding light, reminding him that honesty was stronger than wealth, and kindness richer than gold. Years passed, and the boy grew older. He excelled in his studies, just as he had promised. The billionaire watched proudly as he moved from school to college, always humble, always respectful. The bond between them grew stronger with time. To the maid, the billionaire was no longer just an employer. He had become a guardian, a protector, and a blessing in their lives. The day finally came when the boy graduated, holding his certificate with trembling hands and shining eyes. The billionaire stood beside him, clapping with pride. It was not just the boy's victory, it was his own as well. He had taken a step of faith, and it had rewarded him with something priceless. Looking at the young man in his graduation gown, the billionaire remembered the afternoon years ago when he had pretended to be asleep. He remembered the wallet on the table, the watch shining in the sunlight, and the small hands gently placing a blanket over him. That single moment had changed everything. That single act had turned doubt into trust, loneliness into connection, and wealth into something meaningful. Later that night, as the mansion was quiet and the stars shone brightly outside, the billionaire stood by his window, deep in thought. He realized that true wealth was not measured in the size of his fortune or the number of cars in his garage. True wealth was measured in the purity of a child's heart, in the honesty that could not be bought, and in the kindness that came without expecting anything in return. And so, the billionaire finally understood. He had tested the boy, but in reality, it was life that had tested him. And through the boy's simple act of goodness, he had passed that test.